Florence is today known as one of the most beautiful cities in Italy and one of the cradles of Western civilization. Its art, architecture, and intellectual legacy shaped the Renaissance and influenced the entire world. But the Florence we admire today did not emerge suddenly. To understand how this city became the center of one of the most important cultural revolutions in human history, we must travel back to the year 1500, when Florence stood at the height of its power, wealth, and artistic brilliance. At that time, Florence was not the capital of a vast empire or the seat of a powerful kingdom. Instead, it was a republic governed largely by powerful merchant families, most famously the Medici, despite its relatively small size compared to cities like Constantinople or Cairo. Florence possessed something far more valuable: immense financial influence, an advanced banking system, and a culture that valued knowledge, creativity, and innovation. These elements combined to transform the city into the beating heart of the Renaissance. The origins of Florence go back much further than the Renaissance. The city began as a Roman settlement, founded in 59 BC during the reign of Julius Caesar. Known as Florentia, the settlement was built along the banks of the Arno River and designed according to the typical Roman grid layout, with straight streets intersecting at right angles. Its strategic location along trade routes helped it grow steadily during the Roman period. However, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Florence, like many European cities, experienced centuries of instability, invasions, and economic decline. By the early Middle Ages, Florence had become a modest town surrounded by defensive walls. Yet its location along major trade routes connecting northern Europe to Rome gradually revived its fortunes. Merchants began to pass through the city, bringing goods, ideas, and wealth. By the 12th and 13th centuries, Florence had grown into a powerful commune, governed by guilds representing the city's most influential professions. These guilds, known as the Arti, controlled politics, commerce, and economic regulation. The most powerful among them were the merchant and banking guilds, which financed trade across Europe. Florentine bankers created financial instruments that would later become fundamental to modern banking, including letters of credit and sophisticated accounting practices. By the 1400s, Florence had become one of the richest cities in Europe. Its banking families controlled vast networks that extended from London to Constantinople. Among these families, none became more influential than the Medici. The Medici were not kings or emperors, but their wealth allowed them to exert enormous political influence. Cosimo de' Medici, who rose to power in the early 15th century, transformed the family into the unofficial rulers of Florence. Instead of ruling through open dictatorship, the Medici maintained the appearance of a republic while carefully controlling political alliances and institutions behind the scenes. Their power, however, was not built only on finance. The Medici understood that art, architecture, and scholarship could strengthen both their prestige and the cultural identity of the city. They became patrons of artists, architects, and thinkers whose works would define the Renaissance. By the year 1500, Florence had become a living workshop of creativity. Walking through the city during this period would reveal a place filled with energy and transformation. Streets were lined with stone palaces belonging to wealthy merchant families. Workshops produced textiles, jewelry, books, sculptures, and paintings. Markets filled the central squares with merchants selling goods from across the Mediterranean. At the center of Florence stood one of the most impressive architectural achievements of the time, the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, often simply called the Florence Cathedral or the Duomo. Its enormous dome dominated the skyline of the city. Designed by the architect Filippo Brunelleschi in the 15th century, the dome was an engineering masterpiece. For centuries, builders had struggled to determine how such a massive structure could be constructed without collapsing under its own weight. Brunelleschi solved the problem with an innovative double-shell design and a unique construction method that allowed the dome to be built without traditional wooden scaffolding. The completion of the dome symbolized the ingenuity and ambition of Renaissance Florence. But Florence in 1500 was not only about architecture. The city had become the center of an artistic revolution. The Renaissance, meaning rebirth, was a movement that sought to rediscover the knowledge and aesthetics of classical antiquity while combining them with new ideas about human potential and creativity. Artists in Florence began studying anatomy, perspective, mathematics, and classical sculpture in order to create more realistic and expressive works. Among the artists working in Florence around this time was Leonardo da Vinci, whose curiosity extended far beyond painting into engineering, anatomy, and scientific observation. Another young artist emerging in Florence was Michelangelo Buonarroti, who would soon create one of the most famous sculptures in history, the Statue of David. Completed in 1504, David represented not only biblical heroism, but also the political identity of Florence itself. The city saw itself as a small but courageous republic standing against powerful rivals, much like the biblical David facing the giant Goliath. Florence was also home to major intellectual developments. Humanist scholars studied ancient Greek and Roman texts, seeking to understand philosophy, politics, and literature in new ways. Libraries expanded, universities attracted students from across Europe, and discussions about science, art, and philosophy filled the homes of wealthy patrons. Yet Florence's golden age was not without tension. Political rivalries, religious debates, and social unrest periodically shook the city. In the late 15th century, a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola gained influence by criticizing corruption, luxury, and moral decline. His fiery sermons called for religious reform and condemned the extravagant lifestyle of Florence's elite. For a brief period, Savonarola effectively controlled the city, organizing events known as the bonfires of the vanities, where citizens burned luxury goods, artworks, and books that were considered symbols of moral corruption. However, his influence eventually collapsed, and he was executed in 1498 in the very city he had attempted to transform. By the beginning of the 16th century, Florence continued to balance political instability with extraordinary creativity. Its population was relatively small compared to the great capitals of Europe, yet its influence far exceeded its size. The city had become a laboratory of ideas where artists experimented with perspective, architects designed revolutionary structures, and thinkers debated the nature of humanity and knowledge. The wealth generated by Florence's banking and textile industries continued to finance artistic projects and public works. Churches, palaces, and civic buildings were decorated with frescoes and sculptures that reflected the city's pride and ambition. Even ordinary streets contained workshops where apprentices learned painting, sculpture, goldsmithing, and bookmaking from master craftsmen. Florence's impact during this period extended far beyond its walls. Artists trained in the city carried Renaissance techniques throughout Europe. Merchants spread Florentine financial practices across international trade networks. Scholars shared humanist ideas that would influence education and political thought for generations. By the year 1500, Florence had become something remarkable, a city where commerce, politics, art, and science merged into a powerful cultural engine. While many cities of the time focused primarily on military power or territorial expansion, Florence invested heavily in creativity and knowledge. This unique combination helped spark a transformation that would reshape European civilization. Today, walking through Florence still reveals traces of that extraordinary moment in history. The cathedral dome still dominates the skyline. Renaissance palaces line the streets. Sculptures and paintings created more than 500 years ago remain preserved in churches and museums. Florence stands as a reminder that the strength of a city is not measured only by armies or territory, but by the ideas, creativity, and vision of the people who live there. In the year 1500, Florence was not just a city. It was the birthplace of a new way of thinking about art, science, and human potential, a place where the Renaissance reached its full expression, and where the foundations of the modern world were quietly being built.